So that leads you into African martial arts and, well, trying to find out more about it.
Right.
And presumably that leads us to historical African martial arts, because you were saying if that's here, where did it come from? So that's, you have to dig into the history. So what is HAMA? What is the HAMA Association, and what's it all about? How did it start?
Okay. So HAMA, Historical African Martial Arts Association. So we are we're kind of killing two birds with one stone. So whereas in HEMA, when you're recreating or doing historical reconstruction, and I guess because a lot of ways that HEMA happens, right? So, and people are studying different traditions, but typically, like if you're studying longsword, you're working from a source of information that is no longer practiced, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's people in the HEMA community that are doing things that are like folk practices that may still, like Jogo do Pau in Portugal would be a folk practice, or what we would call a living tradition, right? And that could be maybe not under HEMA, but probably falls under the category of Western martial arts in a larger tree of things. So for HAMA, we cover reconstructing things that are lost, which is kind of in line with what HEMA does. But we also study, and we use a lot as our source material, living traditions, depending on the region and what we're trying to reconstruct. So on one hand, we work on helping to preserve living traditions that, unfortunately, a lot of times, due to the ravages of colonialism, a lot of these practices have gone either underground, or they've had to like shift in a certain way and pivot in a certain way to lose a lot of what they were. Capoeira is a great example of an art that had to pivot in a way in order to survive. And so the form in which we have it today has evolved and has changed drastically from what it was in the 19th century. So that's kind of like what we have. That's kind of a familiar story. What we see in living traditions is that, you know, either they die out and then they get resurrected, and then they resurrected under our, you know, our current times where, you know, people want to make their practices in line with ideas of sport or ideas of folklore or culture. So then the art gets kind of adjusted and shifted under that lens. So that's kind of the drawback of certain living traditions. But so HAMA is part of helping to preserve living traditions, as well as, you know, reconstructing what's lost, and then seeing how these living traditions can help in understanding what was lost depending on the regions. Mathrag, which is an Algerian stick fighting form, is a great example of a living tradition practiced in Algeria and Western Morocco that originally it was used as a way to train for a sword, and then the practice started to evolve based off of colonialism, and then based off of just the need to have like I think what happens with fighting arts, and you notice the same thing happened in Japan, is like when there's no longer a need for using for weapons, hand weapons, and unarmed combat, then what happens is that these practices either become like codified as a sport, or they become like cultural expressions, folkloric in the case for like in the African diaspora, or they become like philosophical tools to kind of like help, you know, guide mind-body tools or whatever else. Yeah. So Methodac was no different. You know, it's like they wanted to make the practice more safe for people to practice, and then to give it the same kind of esteem as other sports and activities. So then there's a certain amount of trappings that come along with that. So, you know, most people don't really know Methodac or associate it with sword, but originally it was supposed to be used to train sword, and the sticks were there for safety. And then the way that the game was played, according to my Sheikh Chadley, before it was once called El Selba, And the way he describes El Selba is basically, I give, then you give. And so it was a way of this free flow, free play kind of activity with the stick. And I think at some point the sheikhs, again, trying to further reform the practice, they stopped playing in that way and started to play in the way we see today, where it's you learn certain striking patterns, and then when you play or compete with each other, the object of the game is like one person attacks while the other person defends, and then you switch roles. Now, sometimes you see though that it doesn't happen so cleanly. Sometimes a person sees an opening and they may break in and sees an opening. But typically, one person will try to overwhelm your defense with attacks, and the other person will try to stay ahead and defend, and then you switch roles. So we see how a living tradition kind of migrated from its original intent. So we're looking at that original intent and looking at the living tradition and trying to work our way back to that that original intent at the same time, while trying to honor and preserve the evolution that the art has taken today. Because it would be wrong for us to just to not be a part of helping these systems to survive. But again, our principle, what we're trying to do is get closer to the historical or the older tradition of fighting. So that's kind of our guiding principle. But at the same time, we're trying to, accomplish a few things at the same time. So Mathurag, not to be so long-winded, but it's a really good example. Mathurag is quite possibly a missing link between our work in reconstructing North African sword based off of Mamluk sources and whatever other North African sources that we find. So we have an invested interest in understanding it as a stick art, and then as a bladed art as well.
Yeah, great. That's a very good example of what HAMA does and what it can do. Obviously, you practice a wide range of African martial arts in HAMA, and that's how you go about learning these systems, which is going back into history and looking at living traditions as well, and putting them together and making logical connections.
Yeah, so we're fortunate in the sense that for parts of Africa, our quote unquote like Middle Ages in a sense.
Yeah.
Not really fair to say Middle Ages for in the African context, but
I get it. Yeah.
People on horses with swords, and fighting in that way. That didn't really end for a lot of places until the 19th century. So it's quite, it's quite feasible to see, the British encountered, when fighting the Mahdi, guys were in mail and with swords and spears. And the Italians encountered Ethiopians. They had artillery and stuff, but they also had, traditional weapons as well. So that's one good thing, is that, that tradition of close quarters fighting with those types of weapons is a lot closer to us. So I can see video footage or old pictures of people fighting, and they were really stubborn for some areas were more stubborn to accept the gun than others, partially because of like tradition and the idea of fighting, but more importantly, well, I should say three reasons. There was the idea of quote unquote manly combat, but then there was also when guns were introduced into Africa, they were not extremely reliable as weapons until much later. And then at that point in time, there was already a control of that technology. So for the Sudanic states, for the states of the Sahel, you know, right between the savannas and the Sahara, you know, the cavalry ruled the day, and they relied heavily on, you know, cavalry charge to bring victories, and they relied heavily on horses to do that. So yeah, so we're a lot closer to that tradition than we're a lot closer to that tradition, which gives us certain benefits. At the same time, again, when this stuff falls out of use, then it either becomes a sport, it becomes, you know, a part of culture as like a folkloric practice. And so we do, depending on different cultures, we do look to some of their like sword dances and stuff for like information and for the ideas of just the movement and manipulation of the body and of the weapon. So yeah, so we use whatever sources we can find. Written sources, 19th century European explorers accounts, because they, you know, again, colonialism was this, you know, terrible thing, and the writers were probably not the best people to get information from. But there are times when you get some really good information. There's some really valuable information that you have to kind of sift through a lot of other stuff, you know.
Yeah, I mean, explorers and, I don't know, journalists, soldiers, politicians, bureaucrats and things going out into Africa. In the 19th century, everybody wrote things down. It was like,
yeah,
you know, they figured, oh, I'm going to write a book one day. And, you know, they liked to write about the people they met and the cultures they met. Even if it wasn't, obviously some are much better or much worse than others, but yeah, every source is something you can tap into.
Yeah. The funny thing in that regards is like, so I was doing some really heavy research into in Ethiopia, and so, you know, Burton has some really strong opinions, and you know, he was remarking just kind of how silly he thought, you know, fighting with, you know, sword and shield was like, oh man, you know, it's like I had to show them like how, I'm paraphrasing Burton, but, you know, pretty much show them how to properly fence. And, you know, they didn't have any understanding of parrying with the sword. They, you know, use this to shield. And so I would just blind them, you know, cause them to raise their shield. And I would, you know, you know, pretty much he's doing this stuff and talking about their shield work and whatever else. And so Burton has this very like kind of condescending kind of attitude towards them. Now there's this other, and this is terrible, that I remember Burton's name, and just because of the volume of accounts I've been reading, I don't remember this gentleman's name. And he spoke very highly on the Abyssinians and their abilities in using the shield for defense. And he was saying how incredible it was to see how well they could ward blows with the shield. And he says it wasn't uncommon to see a shield that had, you know, 20 or 30 saber cuts, and the person who was wielding the shield being killed by a gunshot. And so he said that the only weakness he found with the shield was, of course, from the gun or from like the bayonet or whatever else. But yeah, he spoke very highly about their abilities of using the shields and how effective it was to ward off against these saber attacks. Mm-hmm. Then I think it's the same guy. I could strangle him, right? And he's like, he's in the court of Emperor Theodorus, right? And he's like describing all this stuff, and he's like, and I'm reading this, and he's like, yeah. And then like, you know, men with swords came out, and they started to do like a, you know, like a mock, like, you know, mock battle. And I'm like, all right, like he's so detailed. He's going to describe like this match, this epic match. It's like, I can't wait. Like I'm reading it, and he's like, like, and they drew their swords, and it was like, you know, it was an exciting thing to watch, and then he just moves on, and I'm like, I could kill you right now.
I know the feeling. I've been there, where you're really wanting a description from something, and he's just gonna like, he just brushes over it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a lot of stuff like that. A lot of clues and hints you get, and a lot of reading in between the lines. And I think one thing I like about this process is that, you know, I don't really have to be. I don't have to be the master, the gatekeeper of information and of knowledge, right? Um, I can be like a scientist. I can be I can experiment and I can get down and dirty with the material, but I don't have to be like this. Oh my gosh. Book for me.
New books are great.
Yeah. I don't have to be the master. You know, it's really I get to experience stuff hands on, and I get to be wrong in a way that allows me to revisit what I'm studying and reanalyze. And I think that's probably the most human way to go about learning, putting your hands in, getting dirty, practicing, interacting with people, talking, looking at several different peripheral studies that kind of help to understand this other thing. It's frustrating, but at the end of the day, it's like I don't feel the same kind of pressure with being wrong. Like I can say, hey, I made a mistake, I misunderstood something, or I have some new information, and it's all really exciting and really keeps me grounded, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's how I feel about it as well, about research as well. I don't do what you do. I'd like to do what you do, and I try to find time to do it when I can. But yeah, that's a great element to HAMA and to all historical martial arts studies, of trying to dig into what is no longer there. And
Right.
that brings up maybe my next question.